2026 is proving to be a tumultuous year. Globally, fears of inflation or recession have reached an all time high. Bond markets are in disarray, and fear, uncertainty, and doubt dominate decision making at every level. Donald Trump stands at the center of this storm. Many experts weigh in on his nonsensical actions and sneer at his strategic miscalculations. Indeed, the second Trump presidency has enacted bizarre reforms and executive decisions that appear to lack any coherent rationale. Much of the world mocks US leadership for its apparent absence of strategy. The truth, however, is that there is a plan. The remainder of this analysis is a synthesis of my own reasoning built upon the investigative work of journalist Richard Meadus, specifically his video on Petrogas dollar. I will take a few minutes to explain how Meadus' reporting reveal a clear pattern. The United States is attempting to corner the global energy markets, particularly oil and gas. A key factor is understanding that China, currently the world's workshop holding much of the bargaining power, is heavily dependent on energy imports. Although China is trying to decouple its economy from oil and gas dependency through massive infrastructure investment in renewables, it still relies on crude oil for its industry, not only for energy but also for the byproducts of crude distillation. China has sought to diversify its oil and gas supply and receives discounted supplies from Venezuela, Russia, and Iran due to strategic partnerships with these nations. Since the start of this year, the US has strategically struck all three of China's discounted oil suppliers. In Venezuela, it has forcibly abducted the country's president and taken steps to seize massive offshore crude deposits under duress. The US and its Western allies have effectively imposed a maritime blockade on Russian energy exports, targeting oil and gas refineries and destroying or outright hijacking Russian oil and gas vessels across the world's seas. The situation in the Strait of Hormuz, where the US attacked and assassinated Iran's spiritual leader Khamenei, unfolds in the midst of all this. When contextualized geopolitically, these US actions amount to a squeeze on the energy security of its primary rival, China. The key paradigm shift is the China's definitive rise to a status equal to or exceeding that of the United States. That claim may sound absurd at first, but let us walk through the logic step by step. The current global order was built when the Soviet Union still loomed as a permanent geopolitical presence. The idea was to isolate the USSR and cut off most of its viable trade partners, suffocating it economically. That strategy looked failing at the start, given the capitalist crises of the 1920s through the 1970s. But the stars aligned in the late 1980s, resulting in the total dissolution of the Soviet Union. In a world without the USSR, those institutions had to be retrofitted into a network of alliances and deep military pacts to create a Pax Americana, a peaceful world under American hegemony. Yet the writing was on the wall. Realist geopolitical experts such as Professor John Mearsheimer proclaimed as far back as 1990s that the peace under US hegemony was fragile and that China posed a serious threat to America's hegemonic claim. Now, nearly 20 to 30 years later, thanks to China's immense totalitarian capacity to concentrate resources and its pragmatic outlook regarding its material conditions, China has in some ways surpassed the United States and possesses an even greater capability to overcome the US as a global hegemon. The US has tried to contain China since the late 2000s, but much of the leverage it once possessed as a global superpower has waned. The simple calculus is this: the United States can no longer contain China economically. It played its cards, and China came out on top. The main thrust of my argument is that the US is abandoning its cozy geostrategic position before it crumbles from beneath them. It is trying to outmaneuver and avoid the usual aches and pains of a hegemonic descent by proactively destroying the global institutions built through painstaking effort. The idea is to deny China a peaceful ascent within the current global order and to provoke it into a pitched battle, economic, trade related, and if the US dares, military. Given everything discussed so far, the plan, if one can even call it that, is as follows. With a cornered energy market and a captive string of buyers, Meda's final argument is that this will force the rest of the world to deindustrialize and move capital and reindustrialize the United States. If a strategy is sound, it must account for everything. Every failure mode understood and proactively addressed. Medhurst lightly outlines the challenges facing the US, and I wish to expand on them. As I mentioned moments ago, the US is in the process of destroying its global alliance network and deep military commitments in a bid to gain a temporary upper hand in its rivalry with China. That is the key phrase, temporary. The US is ripping out the wiring of a global hegemony it has been building since the start of the Cold War. In doing so, it is dismantling decades of effort, all for a quick advantage. A key point is the nature of American hegemony, or what some people call the American Empire. To reiterate, the American Empire project was built to counter the threat the Soviet Union posed to the capitalist world. A rhetoric had to be championed that would entice other great and minor powers to band together. Thus, the neoliberal capitalist world order emerged, where great powers were promised shared prosperity and a legal veneer for looting defenseless third world countries through financial engineering and similar mechanisms. The core promise was shared prosperity and the guarantee that the US would uphold this framework invariantly. The US is now in the midst of destroying that invaluable asset, something hard won in the first place. On top of that, it is eroding its own position as the ideological champion of neoliberal capitalism, transforming itself into, as Medhurst puts it, a maritime pirate power. For the time being, it has cornered the energy markets and driven up scarcity by converting one of its steadfast allies, the European Union, into a dependency of sorts. This runs counter to what the American Empire, or its hegemonic project, once stood for. What made American dominance work so well for so long was the promise of shared prosperity. That is why the US garnered so much support. That promise had the upside of making other countries view America as a favorable ally, trade partner, and ideological beacon. The Gulf monarchies willingly collaborated with the US in the hopes of sharing in neoliberal prosperity, allowing the US to set up military bases across the region. The sudden bellicose attitude towards key US allies and the desire to use those allies as yet another chess piece in what amounts to a pump and dump scheme leaves much to be desired. With the US initiated attacks on Iran, the Gulf monarchies suddenly found themselves as yet another chess piece in a larger geopolitical conflict. As Machiavelli put it, inviting a great power to win a conflict for you will eventually cause that great power to vassalize you. Another factor is the total incineration of America's propaganda, public relations efforts, and global image. The concept of the consent of the masses if I am using the term correctly, is fascinating. When I say masses, I do not mean the domestic public support for the US government at home. Rather, for a very long time, the US has been portrayed as the leader of the free world, a force for good, and a defender of a peaceful world order. Through active propaganda efforts and the passive network effect of its immense cultural strength, the US was able to condition even the most unassuming person to view it in a positive light despite its various atrocities. This is an extraordinarily difficult feat. For the entire world to see you as the good guy requires complex and intricate social engineering. This was evident in the late Soviet era, when even Soviet officials began to view the US as a savior and a lifeline for their liberalization efforts, rather than their actual rival. The US won the culture war so decisively and thoroughly against the USSR that its own elites torched the revolutionary project, an event unheard of in history. US officials were stunned to witness it. Such is the power of the consent of the masses. Winning hearts and minds can go a very long way. More importantly, this new US strategy, or as Donald Trump puts it, the Donroe Doctrine, only works as long as one assumes that the other poles in this emerging multipolar world stands by idly as passive observers. This is a grave strategic error. A key point to understand is that while instability in the Middle East may be an ultimate good in the short run for the US to consolidate its dominant position in energy markets, its military edge, which lent it superpower status, is permanently gone. It is also abundantly clear that the military incursion is not going as planned for the US, as Iran has been waging a ruthless asymmetric campaign against it. Without the belief in American military superiority, there is no American empire. All of this leads to my main point. The US plans to use global economic chaos as a strategic tool to pit countries against each other economically. This is what we proverbially call playing with fire. The resulting chaos is unpredictable and may not always fall in the favor of the US. Since Trump took office, he has crossed many red lines in international geopolitics. This has unfortunately set a precedent, and like many things, it can become a slippery slope. To draw a conclusion, the United States has willingly created a situation of chaos, hoping to emerge on top of a global energy crunch. It has willingly dismantled most of its Cold War soft power apparatus, along with real hard power alliance networks. It has willingly given up many of the global institutions that gave it a cutting edge advantages that simple hard power could not achieve. All of this unfolds against the backdrop of an ascendant country in East Asia, which for ideological and rhetorical reasons the US views as a rival. All of this is for a temporary upper hand, one that may or may not materialize into actual gains. That is the dangerous part. America abandoned its carefully engineered position, which had typically denied other countries a path to escalation. Now the field is wide open for escalation, and the strategy itself demands further escalation if it fails, an all or nothing attitude that is as damaging as it can be for any hope of lasting peace. For now, however, the peace under American hegemony, the Pax Americana, has decisively ended. Only time will tell what will replace it.